Testing English Channel, testando o canal de inglês. Deu, né?
Alô,
Pois
alô,
é, só
inglês.
isso, ó. Se mudar qualquer
Testando.
coisa,
A questão da transmissão ao vivo, a equipe técnica vai me dar o ok, só para... Tá, ok. Senhoras e senhores, bom dia. O
ladies and
Conselho
gentlemen, good morning. The Federal Bar of the Brazilian Lawyers Association, in partnership with the Institute of Administrative Law, holds the event 10th anniversary of the Anti-Corruption Corporate Law, number 12,846/2013, Reflections and New Paradigms. Please, now we ask you to keep your cell phones on the silent mode. The panel is made of the President of the Administrative Commission, Sanctioning Administrative Law, Dr. Fábio Osório. A round of applause for everyone present here. And the Minister of the State of the National Controller's Office, Vinícius de Carvalho. To open the work, we pass the floor to the President of the Commission of Sanctioning Administrative Law, Dr. Fábio Osório. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to initially salute the Justice Minister Carvalho and the Minister of the National Controller's Office, to thank him for his presence in this seminar that celebrates the 10th anniversary of the Corporate Anti-Corruption Law, Reflections, and on its new paradigms. I'd like to thank the President of the Federal Bar of Lawyers Association in Beto Simonetti for the support of the Special Committee of the Sanctioning Administrative Law in the Federal Bar. And for this initiative, I'd like to thank the Bank of Brazil for the support to this event. I'd like to thank all of the speakers and moderators that are in this seminar. And without a doubt, I'd like to mention here the Minister of Carvalho, that makes this seminar really an important one, especially considering a legal expert as he is, professor and doctor of law by the University of São Paulo, a legal expert that is renowned, former president of the Administrative Council of Economic Activity, CADE, that has been leading very well, the National Controller's Office, and he is a differentiated legal expert, and he also has a view of a manager, and he has a cross-disciplinary view of the law, with a possibility of economically analyzing law and a in-depth knowledge of the law, such as the sanctioning administrative law, and also anti-corporate corruption. So therefore, it has a major contribution to make to Brazil, as he is doing, ahead of the National Controller's Office and to the academic world, with pragmatic reflections, a pragmatic view, and an academic view, establishing a bridge that gaps the academic and the real world. Therefore, welcome Minister Vinícius de Carvalho, and we wait anxiously here for your reflections. Thank you very much.
Uma salva de palmas, por gentileza.
A round of applause, please.
Agradecemos as palavras do Dr. Fábio Medina
We
Osório.
thank Dr. Fábio Eudino Osório for his initial remarks, and now we'll listen to the Minister of State of the National Controller's Office, Vinícius de Carvalho. Good morning, everyone. And starting, I would like to thank Dr. Fábio de Osório that held a very important position in the Special Committee of Administrative Sanctioning, to thank the President. He's a great friend who's doing a very good work, especially opening the floor to the holding of the seminar on such a relevant topic. And in an heroic attempt to... Sorry, but the interpretation cannot hear the speaker well enough. A interpretação se desculpa, mas não consegue ouvir o palestrante bem. O microfone está muito baixo. In this event of 10 years on the application, the law itself and its specific about the reflection of the process of application. As the legal sociology, in North American legal sociology,
essa dualidade entre law in the books and law in action. E a gente tem aqui, eu acho que claramente, no caso da Lei Anticorrupção, uma aplicação, um exemplo forte dessa dualidade, né, do que era a lei escrita, interpretada naquele momento inicial, em seus dispositivos, e o que foi essa lei em ação, né, o que foi essa lei sendo aplicada ao longo dos últimos 10 anos. E talvez um elemento relevante para iniciar a discussão seja fazer uma comparação com a própria questão, com a própria política ou lei de defesa da concorrência no Brasil. O Dr. Fábio mencionou, eu fui presidente do CAD, trabalhei no CAD durante 8 anos, passei por várias...
I worked in CAD for many years. After that, I became a professor.
Concorrencial e regulação. Quando a lei de concorrência surge no Brasil, ela faz parte de um movimento muito similar ao que aconteceu com o surgimento da Lei Anticorrupção. Qual que é esse movimento? Até a década de 80, mais ou menos, a noção de aplicação de uma política de defesa da concorrência em cada país era algo muito atrelado a conjunturas específicas de cada país, a uma lógica muito peculiar de aplicação de uma política concorrencial relacionada à competitividade do país como um todo e muito atrelada a questões de superação do subdesenvolvimento nos países em desenvolvimento e nos países mais ricos, principalmente nos Estados Unidos, há uma noção de que a lei concorrencial ela tinha que servir para inibir, né, a formação ou a concentração do poder econômico a partir de uma perspectiva
of economic power, with the perspective of defense, of producers and defense of the relations of compensation of power within a productive chain, in a relationship between employers and employees, in a logic that if you leave the power, if the power of is too concentrated within the hands of the power, there isn't much way to balance the situation. So this is a logic that is connected to an industrial policy logic, and as any industrial policy, it is connected to something that is restricted to the borders of a specific country within a national development strategy. And this is the case, this is the case so much that the discussion of the competition law starts happening within that period in the 40s, in the 50s, where CAD is after that CAD is created. And this law basically is voted and decided on the National Congress during 15 years. And the discussions that happened, and we see all of the notes of the representatives and the government, they wanted to create a competition legislation to protect Brazil from the international trusts, international cartels, and to enable to make possible the development of national industry. The discussion about corruption was not so different back then, and with more vigor, the association with overcoming corruption within the process of development. The and the idea that countries, as they developed, they would also develop culturally in the relationships between the state and the private parties, and that would enable the reduction of the corruption levels. And if we carry on in terms of the corruption within the United States from the 20th to the change of the 20th century, 19th to 20th, there were many scandals. There were many complaints about the balance between economic and political power. That was discussed a lot. No wonder there was the expression that was coined, the robber barons, the big corporate American owners that held hostage the political and economic process, showing that even though corruption was a very serious problem, it is not a barrier to economic growth. The US had high rates of economic growth and high rates of political corruption. And that caused consequences down the line. It was a sort of steroid that caused negative consequences in the American economy, such as the one of the 1929 economic crisis and the stock market crash. So this process is going to take place in a similar manner until in the 60s, especially in the 80s, at the end of the Cold War, with the process of trade opening. Many different countries were opening, globalization was growing, and privatization was happening as well. And then there is the economic agenda of many different states. In the 70s, we had the CPA, and that was an agenda of the national states, an agenda of the OECD, of establishing a level playing field in the world. So the world is globalizing, the barriers are falling down, international trade has to be perfected and has to be encouraged throughout the world. Multinational corporations and foreign direct investments are going to countries and for the production and as well in financial investment as well. So we have to level the playing field so that companies from specific countries don't have advantages over other companies from different countries in a competition within a specific territory. And two different agendas show or start after the universalization of this level playing field. And one of them is the competition law. Okay, and in the late 80s, there were no more than 30 competition law authorities or competition agencies working, and at the end of 2020, at the 2010s, there were over 130 authorities with very similar policies and very similar functions as well. Even though in the structure they're different, the functionalities or their functions had very similar agendas. And the same happened with the definition of corporate corruption and the need to hold people, hold legal entities accountable in matters related to corruption. That spread throughout the world, and it arrived in Brazil too. And the turning point was our 2013 law that was passed. And here we have a major importance in the application of these two laws. I always like to highlight. In the competition law, it was created in Brazil with structures and goals after 1994, and CADE was turned into an autarky back then. And the goals were much simpler. You structure merger and acquisitions, you have to assess, but it's done after the fact, and after the merger and the acquisitions happen. And in the competition law, you didn't have an enforcement detection that was decent. There was no possibility for you to have plea bargain agreements. There is no possibility for CADE to issue warrants to search warrants and search operations, and that started in the early 2000s. That was a very gradual application. The first plea bargain agreement that was signed in competition law was in 2003. That is almost 10 years after the application of the law, of the enforcement of the law, and after CADE was established in 1994, and then there was a second law that restructured in 2011 the whole system of competition. Within these 20 years, CADE basically organized its agenda in terms of agreements, organizations, and in terms of agreement as well. And within this, the assessment of the TCU and all the other people involved. Within this lab and of political pressure as well, within this lab environment, you have the possibility to adjust these variables of temperature, pressure, and adjusting to what's necessary, incorporating into your agreement agenda, and that's an example of negotiating policies. That's what happened with CADE. What happened is, in terms of the enforcement of the competition law, was the opposite. The law established in 2013. In 2014, car wash operation happens, and questioning the competence of the National Controller's Office about the enforcement of the law, whether it had the competence to enforce the law, based on the absurd argument that the CGU could not enforce the anti-corruption law because there would be a conflict of interest, as this car wash operation identified crimes made within the federal government by political agents, and especially by managers or high-level managers within the state companies. CGU would be compromised to do this, to hold these investigations. And in reality, it leads me, if this reasoning would be applied to this law for the law should not be enforced at all, because and the anti-corruption, if they are state agents, they would have to, we would have to apply the or enforce the law involving these cases. And CGU has not the competence to punish political agents, and that conflict of interest established first. How am I going to have a conflict of interest if I don't have the competence to sentence a person that would lead me to have the conflict of interest? It is a complete nonsense, and that's what happened for many years. The courts, all the legal justice system engaged in this idea, saying that the public prosecution service had the competence until the TRF4 from the 4th region said that there was competence, and the agreements were made in parallel.
E o Tribunal de Contas.
Isso. And to put as the advisor or the person assessing this process here, as in the area of competition, in areas of bidding processes or tender processes in the government that involve public interests and public resources, and the Federal Prosecution Service and the CADE
se colocou à disposição para assinar os acordos de leniência em conjunto com o CADE e fazer.
Together with CADE, wanted to sign the agreement against those companies that did not celebrate the leniency agreement, that were being accused against the natural individual that did not celebrate the leniency agreement. The ministry put itself in a position of applying the anti-corruption law with the entities. So these were stories where you have two normative marks that, even though they had the same root in terms of theoretical, fundamental, and geopolitical, and impact on the structure of developing the country and institutions geared towards the development of the country, and they had the same nature, even though all this were on the table, because of very distinct historical context, the application were very different. So the challenges today are also very different. What is the first, and here I'm talking obviously about on the perspective of a general manager ahead of this process. What is the first big challenge, as far as I understand today? Because of Lava Jato, car wash, we had almost 18 billion reais during this time. In different situations like this, such as this, we ended up creating a kind of superposition and competence among the entities, CADE being one of the most important ones, the main ones, and this generated very clear problem for structure when it comes to new agreements. In the case of the policy of competition based on the prisoner, that it is utilized to detect cases. In the case of the anti-corruption law, this would not happen. This agreement on leniency against corruption, this would work more like a term of conduct. You already know the case, the authority is investigating the case, and he goes there and say, well, I want to do a leniency agreement. In other words, most of the time, it's not the company that brings this on to the judiciary, but it's an agreement that the corporation will cooperate in order to help the investigation, contribute, and pay a proportion of the fine, and then the process ends around that company that has signed that leniency agreement. So we don't have a structure for as far as incentive that we do in the corporate area. How do you organize this nowadays? So that we are able to create what kind of an incentive for the leniency agreement, we need to improve our detection capability. Note that this was a point that in the last 10 years, opposite of what happened in CADE, we were almost ecstatic with the case of all the cases of corruption that came after the car wash incident, and what showed up at that moment was enough to prove that the anti-corruption law worked and it was being applied, when in reality some of these cases they did not apply. These are cases that ended before the law was in place, but we created this sensation that everything's okay, when in reality very little was done in order of detecting and improving our capability of detecting illicit when it comes to anti-corruption law. So what are we doing in terms of this? CGU, the National Controller's Office, as far as I'm concerned, until a few time ago, there was 3 entities that were segmented in order to detect this. It was within CGU and they barely dialogued and spoke among each other. And then they could be organized and take into consideration all the questions having to do with these laws in order to make the auditing of the cases and give it to the area that's responsible for the anti-corruption law. The same thing was with our place when we detected the frauds among the people involved. We would take them to this anti-corruption law and then get responsible people and start investigations so that this can be detected. Aside from that, there's a whole area that makes an effort to work in partnership with the federal police that we call special operations in different states, and then they can take into consideration and prioritize the investigations related to anti-corruption law. This effort is that we're making to coordinate these areas internally so that we are able to have good cases, structured cases, cases that have a construction within that respect each other, and so that these entities are working in a coordinated manner, are able to work like that, and that's a big challenge. It's a challenge to detect, the challenge of detection. And the second biggest challenge is the challenge in institutional multidisciplinarity. We need to solve the effect of anti-corruption law the last few years that was so uncoordinated, external uncoordination, not only in CGU, but CGU and other organs. CGU with CADE, we celebrated an agreement, a technical agreement recently, like a month ago, that was able to allow the coordination in cartels and other entities, and you're able to rationalize the agreements and the calculation on the fines and contribution, particular contributions. We're going to be realizing manifestations that are work together with CAGE when in this option. We're also working with the finance department, and so that we can also establish a flow and exchange information with a court of auditors and the auditing court, and then the values that are determined by CGU. We're working on that. And beginning of next year, we're going to have all that organized. And as long as the public ministry is working with us, we have been talking a lot with them so that we're able to organize some kind of order, how to put our competences together. And especially in the public ministry, the important thing is that we're working with the same objective, using the same words, building the same rules and measures and criteria, and for investigation, the same criteria for investigating the companies, because so that there's no so we are on the same page for all topics. We need to work in that direction. The Secretary Marcelo is working with this. We're going to be remodeling the public ministry with a new prosecutor, general prosecutor, and we hope from then on we can structure a cooperative agenda so that next year we can focus on these matters. And on the third point, to end, it's about the private integrity. It's a theme that's very important with this anti-corruption law and compliance. And this has maybe been one of the biggest success of the anti-corruption law in Brazil. It was the fact that these companies, in a general manner, were able to structure the compliance law minimally effective. And of course, you're able to improve. I add here my friend, Ulysses, and was able to be in front of the governance of Petrobras, and it's pretty strange, but he's doing a very competent job in the area of integrity of the company. And I believe that we, in this private entity, it's really important. We have created some things that got reviews from press last week, and it's not important only to get all these the companies. Sometimes they start with maybe an inadequate structure, but they enter this journey together with CGU and being accepting the new fitting with the new form, and from then on it's not going to be just an award based on anti-corruption law. It's not enough for a corporation not to be corrupt to be integral. It's not enough to have to be a corporation that's not corrupt, but it does get involved with other things such as slave work and things of the matter. We need to access all these other criteria, work with them. In the new edition, it's going to be in about 2 years. We're going to be able to see that. But above all, have an integrity program that all the companies are able to be inserted in this process, in this journey, like I mentioned, and participated in the net answering questions and improving. You have basically nowadays in the whole country but especially in its most important corporate center, we have professionals that are qualified in this area. And we have it was a profession that came about 10 years ago, and now it's a profession that's really very well recognized in the corporate area, that are the agents and the compliance officers and so on, and are out there on seminars and interacting with many other agents and corporate agents, and with government people that can also be inserted in this agenda, so that we are able to advance within this integrity agenda as a whole. Corruption is a very complex problem. Corruption, and the fact that it is a complex problem, I mentioned in the beginning that many times it can be a species of stimulating for the economy, but the perversive effects will come in sequence. The effect of the corruption of these institutions and companies and corporations is the loss of trust in these institutions, in the politics and the programs, that in the limit, it gets a systemic and loss of trust in the political regime and in the state as well, where it cannot take the risk so that this will happen or keep perpetuating. So cutting this problem on the root, we're able to improve and have no more repression and be efficient. That's why I mentioned the detection agenda. So we have to deal with this in relation to the prevention and the dimension and the integrity of the point of view of the effectiveness of the institution and the quality of the policies. This has a very positive impact in the reduction of the index of corruption and the improvement of how society see and trust a private corporation, and which is also an element that's really relevant within this spectrum of trust in society and the institution and organization as a whole. And as we are having, we capitalize from these big entities, these profits end up giving a lot of responsibility towards citizens. It starts back then with social responsibility, then it goes to other kinds of agendas. And today we have internalization of all this, and we're reflecting on them. And this is the way we're trying to go. And I hope that in the next 4 years, and the mandate of President Lula can be able to perform this overall. This is it, and thank you very much. We want to thank the speech by the Minister of State of Contraloria Union, Minister giving. We now want to go to the President of a Special Commission of Sanctioning Law, Minister Fábio Medina Osório. We would like to ask the audio team to open the main audio. I'd like to thank the Minister Vinicius Matos de Carvalho was a brilliant speech. He gave a history, impeccable history on the fight against corruption from the United States to Europe, and all this agenda has been developing in Brazil and the origins of this law 12,646, and the role of the National Controller's Office in Brazil, and highlighting effectively this new conception that minister brings for CGU, like the protagonist, very important protagonist that has an experience as former protagonist of CADE, because of this intersection of the anti-corruption law and other judiciary disciplines, also when it comes to this important protagonism that CAD has on the administrative law, the sanctioning Brazilian area. This is essential for the development of the CGU itself, and there's no reason at all for this lack of trust in other institutions and the role of those institutions that are linked to the executive power. It's not a place that has a monopoly in combating corruption. On the other hand, what we have seen recently in Brazil was, I say, the reform even of the law 8,429 from 92. It was a diagnosis of excess in combating corruption, and in a way, these excess and abuse of power and it was also a diagnosis that it was done by the Lava Jato, the car wash operation, that brings us to an important reflection on the equilibrium that it has to be adopted, and also on a dosage of these depressing measures that Minister mentioned about this equilibrium from the prevention and repression, especially when it's we're talking about the responsibility of the companies, but this also of the responsibility of physical people and the companies, because there is an important vision on the agenda of development that needs to be taken by the authorities. And so I think it's really important, this exposition.
Due to the accountability of the overseeing entities, this mindset that the excess of remedy against corruption or transgressions, because corruption might be a legal concept that is not determined, such as improbity or corporate improbity, and specific transgressions might be interpreted, such as very excessive definition crimes that are very open, and they can lead to the failure or the bankruptcy of these companies, and that might also to not proportional activities, and that might lead to increase of the tax burden. For example, here in Brazil, there are certain taxes that go to this directed to the consumers, excessive fines against the companies. They might pass this on to the consumers through costs that they might have to take into account. So all of this has to be very equated and has to be very considered by the authorities. And when they sanction companies in the realm of this supervision or overseeing, so the balance of an authority, as Minister Carvalho, that works in the competition area, because the competition area is in touch realistically with the economic area. So Minister Vinicius de Carvalho is a person that brings this special characteristic to the National Controller's Office, which is something that is unheard of in public management. So I'd like to congratulate him, to greet him for the great explanation, very detailed explanation, and say that we are really happy not only for his contribution in this space, but also this contribution ahead of the CGU. So we'd like to thank him for the participation in the seminar. Right now, the opening panel is going to be undone, and we thank the presence of the authorities, and I ask you to continue with us if you wish so.
Perfeito. Bom, senhoras e senhores, teremos então o painel 1, a responsabilidade
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have panel 1, the objective accountability according to the corporate and to the law and the former minister head of the International Studies Institute and president of the Special Commission of Sanctioning Administrative Commission of the Federal Bar Association, Dr. Osório, Fábio Medina Osório. Now, good morning, everyone. And now it's up to me to talk about the objective accountability or responsibility in the anti-corruption corporate law. And I will bring certain reflections about this topic to try and contribute with this debate. Remember, I would like to remind you that this seminar is being broadcast online, streamed live in Portuguese and in English, and it's being followed live. Therefore, we're here dealing with the new paradigms of the corporate anti-corruption law of 2013. To deal with this topic, the objective responsibility of legal entity of this law, I'd like to establish some premises. The first premise has to do with the discussion on in which moment this strict liability was introduced in the Brazilian legal system of the corporate entity, a legal entity. And the first discussion that should be established. And what kind of strict liability we're talking about? This corporate strict liability, or the legal entity strict liability, is different from the strict liability that is provided for in the 88 Constitution, which is the one of the state. As a compensation for damages, the civil liability of the state, which is a type of objective or strict liability of the legal entity, which is the one of the state, that is provided for in the 88 Constitution. So we have to differentiate this liability, the strict liability of the legal entity, dealing with it with as an liability of sanctioning administrative aspect. So it is important to establish this liability as in the law of 2013 as the liability established by the sanctioning administrative law against corruption or corruption acts committed by third parties, because the legal entity doesn't act on its own. It always manifests its willingness by third parties. So it's not the same as the civil liability or the state liability. This was provided for in the Constitution of 88. There is a difference between the state liability that was in the Constitution of 88 and the liability of the legal entity in the sanctioning administrative law again for acts of corruption by third parties. And on the other hand, these responsibilities that is within the corporate liability law due to acts of administrative acts, it is a very specific liability. Sanctioning administrative law and corruption acts. It doesn't mean that there are other types of legal entities in the administrative law, such as the accountability on the labor law. Before this law was passed, there was the liability in the labor law and other types of liability, but not due to corruption acts in the sanctioning administrative law. Not in the strict liabilities in this sphere. Therefore, there is a consensus, especially due to legislative works and the recognition within the Office of the Controller General, in the sense that this modality of responsibility due to actions or corruption acts was an innovation of the law that was passed in 2013. before this law going into effect, this was not a type of strict liability that was in effect. And especially within the procurement law here in Brazil, it was subjective. And the law 2846 could not be applied, could not be enforced retroactively. So the Office of the Controller General had a specific liability before the law 2846 and a way of liability that was subjective. What was the subjective liability that was enforced not only by the Office of the Controller General, but the state agencies as well? It was the assessment of willingness or fault or guilt according to the natural persons. The punishment of the companies had to do with the assessment of the willingness of the act or the fault of the natural persons. And that was extremely necessary for the accountability of the companies or for establishing the liability. And therefore, we had the principle of fault-based liability. And it was the accountability of the corporate entities at the light of this of the previous law of the malfeasance law, or in this case, a misconduct law, because the companies, they were under the other law, they weren't under the other law 8429 as the beneficiaries of the act of misconduct. And a lot of them were in the defendants, and a lot of them in these lawsuits, even though it was not correctly developed, the thesis of accountabilities of the legal persons. Let's see the lack of individualization of the natural persons. When people, workers of the legal entity were practicing and bad or misconduct, and these people were not part of the board of directors of this corporation. Some more water, please. These workers and within the federal institution to represent the legal entity for commission of acts in the procurement process or in a tender process. And let's say that is the hypothesis. These workers were conducting irregularities or misconduct, and they were in, as they were defendant in an action, a lawsuit of mispractice or misconduct. But these people were not doing this because they have the responsibility of the social contract. The directors had the responsibility of, and they were the people establishing the willingness of the legal entity. And let's say that the person filing the suit doesn't produce evidence in the sense that the workers were not connected whatsoever with the directors of the legal entity in order to commit this situation. And what is this situation like in an action of misconduct? And with the lack of the subjective link or bond, and describing the principle of culpability, and due to the lack of the individualization of the conduct of the natural person in the legal corporation, legal entity. So the principle of the fault-based liability presumes the description of the legal person and the description of a conduct that will materialize the willingness of the legal entity, or the description of the conduct of someone that is following the orders of the person that materialized the willingness, the will of the legal entity. So there might be a plea bargain in the sense of elements to corroborate this. There should be this link here. At the light of the law 8,429 of or the procurement law as well. Under the law before the Anti-Corruption Act's law. And right after that, in all the normative system, what is the normative system in terms of the system of fault-based liability, and how does it work? And now, there are many lawsuits of misconduct don't have the elements due to the lack of description of the subjective elements of the conduct, and for basically saying that this didn't happen. What happened with this? The change in the law of the action against misconduct in public office. It made it not applicable in the third article when it says that when the fact is an act of corporate misconduct, or in can be framed in the law of corruption acts, this law is enabled or enforced to the legal entity, and the law of public misconduct is not applicable or enforced in the legal entity. Well, if this is true, and the law is self-enforceable in the immediate aspect, what happens here? In the process that are ongoing, in the actions against misconduct in public office that are ongoing, we must say that the process should be dismissed in case this same facts that are mentioned against this legal entity are infraction that is typified or that are defined in the Anti-Corruption Act corporate law. Because if those facts are based in the law, this law, The action against misconduct in public office should be dismissed because you should send the file to the Office of the Controller's Office and not the other way around. And in the situation of the legal entity, the presuppositions or the presumption are totally different. In the action against misconduct, the principle of liability is subjective, right? It's true if the facts are before the anti-corruption corporate law. This law is not enforced, it's not applicable. This rule is not applicable. This rule is applicable if the facts happen after the passing of the law. Only what's applicable is the tender law or the procurement process law or action against misconduct in public office. But let's look at the corporate anti-corruption corporate law, because we're looking at the fault-based liability principle, and this principle has been misinterpreted considering legal entities or even natural persons. And it is connected to the arbitrary power and the description of the conduct that is forbidden, the causal link, and also guilt, and how this should be described in the initial part of the lawsuit, as this should be described. Let's look at the objective or the strict liability. There are some reports within the Office of the Controller, the General Controller, saying that the fault-based liability is that it presumes the analysis of intent and fault of the physical or the natural persons. That was a decision that was passed within the administration of the Minister Wagner Rosario. I have the report here. But it's a report that has the specific understanding. It is the decision on the case Promon. 00190 0041 65/2015, and the interested party is Promon Engenharia Limitada. So the adequate interpretation of the expression fault-based liability, it means to attribute that to the illegal entities and represented by its members. That's the report. In a consortium, it is necessary to show the individualized liability of each one of the companies that are in consortium, and it's not enough the evidence that's to say that one of the companies defrauded the procurement process. But in relation to intent and of the agents, it seems that strict liability is not exactly this. It's not what I mention in my work. What I mention is another type of theoretical position in the sanctioning administrative law. The strict liability of the legal entity walks hand in hand for an organization in failure. So if there is an act, if there is a corrupt act that is practiced, or fraud, an objective fraud, that is perpetrated or materialized in this situation, what has to be investigated in terms of the accountability or liability of the legal entity is the possibility of avoiding that act. Naturally, if there are excluding factors, considering the non-existence of the fact, if there are excluding situations due to the non-existence of the fact, or the causal link, the lack of the causal link with the person, that is the representative of the corporation, it means that this excluding factor is going to affect the legal entity or the lack of material aspect of the fact. So there is some excludent situations that affect the legal entity. That affects the liability of the legal entity. There is no material aspect. There is a lack of linking bond between the person and the fact that impacts the liability of the legal entity. There are some exclusionary conducts that impact, but as the fraud existed and it was proved, if the fraud was proved, there is a concrete problem for the legal entity to face. If there is an affirmation of the fraud, if a confirmation of the fraud, there are some exclusionary facts that will not help the legal entity. I'd like to say hi to the Justice Navarro, who's just arriving here, that there will be exclusionary causes that will not help the legal entity. In this sense, fraud, the legal entity will have to prove that whether we have to work with the concept of avoidability within the organization. Because in the fault-based liability, we have to consider that each corporate entity, so if we consider the multinationals,
and if we do a parallel to this company, this private company, we need to trace also for the public sector. We cannot, be more strict with the private sector than the public sector. And that's what we need to take into consideration. If in the public sector, an integral sector, for instance, the judiciary, if we consider the judiciary, for instance, or the executive power, or any other institution, in other words, one that's integral, she will admit, will she admit any statistics of corruption? An honest institution in Brazil, will she tolerate any kind of statistics of a corruption index? If such institution with a reasonable amount of integrity accepts any kind of corruption index, even with having compliance mechanisms and controlling mechanisms, why won't we adopt the same kind of parameters as the private sector? That's the question. That's my point. For instance, the Brazilian judiciary or the armed forces, for instance, other institutions and the executive power. Let's say if we look at an evolution of the executive power, it will have problems of corruption. Any institution will have a corruption. Listen, even in Norway, you have corruption. Even in Finland, everywhere you do have corruption. So any institution will have some kind of index of corruption. And so if she does have that index of corruption, obviously, we have to admit that any big corporation may have this corruption at some point. Will you punish this corporation if there is fraud necessarily? No, you cannot just necessarily do it in an objective way. You have to verify always if the company has the mechanisms of compliance. And if it does, as far as I know, these mechanisms, and this is what I'm writing in my work, that's why I say these mechanisms of compliance effectively, they don't just exist to bring down sanctions, or to make them easier, or to exclude the causing factor. If they do have compliance factor, they have to exclude what's causing among the conduct of the company and its culpability by the effective organization. And this is where we come with the theory and thesis of defect organization when it comes to this is also why we bring in our work in culpability of the legal entity and defective law is when the legal entity adopt measures. And then this, I could talk a little bit longer about this. I'm going over my time, I'm sorry, but I want to say that effective compliance, who has a great guide of compliance is CADE. We need to combat the CADE. We have to combat the facade, and we have to have a structure that's more certified, more and more certification. And the corruption law, when it came, I went to the yellow pages of Veja. It was 2014. As a jurist, I said, I wasn't minister yet, I was just this. We can have an industry of compliance. So we have several offices that's going to be working on it. And that's when it came up. The problem today is first to format compliance based on certification, international certification. And for instance, listen, We have Proética and CGU. There's no point in having certifications that have no credibility. We need to search and look for international certification. We need to try to have certifications at CGU and the compliance based on certifications. We need to have criteria, ethical sustainability for compliance. And we need to look to have the concept of officer compliance that's independent, an independent one, so that this council of officer compliance is more and more, works more and more. And we've had the governors and directors, governance, such as Navarro, Spinelli, and other technicians that were excellent on the market, and the market began to use these technicians of this magnitude in order to add credibility for the companies, the private companies and public companies, because we cannot look at the private companies and not having the credibility of the governance manager and their compliance officer. And why is that? Because we live in a time where my dear friend Diogo de Figueiredo Moreira Neto used to say, public space is not from the state. Public space not from the state. That's where the private companies need to cooperate with the public sector that's not state-owned, and need to cooperate also with the private sector, the state-owned part. Then we're going to be able to reduce this punitive spectrum of the public ministry. It needs to occupy all the space, with all this will of giving fines and the checking, excessive checking. We need to move towards auto-regulation, auto-monitoring, and more judiciary safety, and where all the companies together with the judicial power go to this solution of conflict, like in the United States, outside of the judiciary, because no one anymore can take trying to survive within this judiciary. The judiciary power is very unpredictable, it's very slow, it's very expensive. I remember studying in college Dennis Lloyd, the idea of law, and he used to say, the law is the same for everyone, just like the hits is anybody can start, anybody can get in the courts, but how long does it take for you to resolve a contentions? And just like Gustavo Belka, I studied in the 90s. It's the right, and it should be a malleable right in the hands of the public authority and the judiciary power and the public ministry, and we don't know this, what kind of right we have. Tomorrow it's a new one. So it's much better to look for these regulating agencies that are composed by technicians, which is CGU, like CAD, and there are agencies that are specialized in solving conflicts outside of judiciary. In other words, an auto-regulation, auto-composition. So this law of anti-corruption, the anti-corruption law that's in the corporation, it's to help effective compliance and allow that are some agencies here that are those in the executive power. We can look at the paradox that Minister Marcos Carvalho mentioned here. Authorities trying to have the monopoly to combat corruption in Brazil trying to promote a regulation, a retro-regulation, much more distant from reality, over illicit things, when the reality, the way is prevention, and allow auto self-regulation to take its course. So I see that these concepts, they're fluid, should permeate this auto and self-regulation, and the concept of self-responsibility, that's objective that we're talking about here, are filled, let's say, so to speak, from a perspective that can be understood by a sustainable corporation, and the company can understand that a fault or a problem in her corporation can generate responsibility, and through an ethical sustainability, she can prevent that. And the responsibility, the subjective responsibility, which is the concept before the law, can be better understood. But this concept of objective responsibility is not a concept of integral risk. It is an idea. It's a very important idea and topic, because sometimes the concept of objective responsibility is mixed with one of integral responsibility. And responsibility for entire integral risk, it's like the company was responsible for everything that's happening. And if that was the case, so any fraud that's happening in the corporation, she would be punished. That's not how it works. There are many excluded factors that should be defended. The company is not punished automatically because fraud somehow happened. The company has, the entity has the right to fight. The fact may not have happened. It may have not have anything to do with some unnatural person, and the fact the company may be very well organized, very well structured, and has a right to present that. And I repeat, any institution that is very well structured in her compliance and her mechanisms of integrity, and cooperate with institutions that are fiscalizing everything, she might have some index of corruption in her organization. So the occurrence of frauds in any organization, no matter how wonderful she is, can happen. What she needs to come to fruition is to take these and give it to the public entities. It's not just because one fraud happened inside the organization, she'll immediately be punished. That's not how it works. So these reflections that I wanted to bring here, and thank one more time President Beto Simonetti for the help, support of the sanctioning and the seminar. President Beto Simonetti has done a very important managing of this, and he is overseeing OAB, and especially thanking him and all the speakers, especially starting with Minister de Carvalho, and all of us who are here in the seminar. Thank you very much to everyone who has been listening to us. Thank you. I want to thank Fábio Medina de Osório, and I would like to ask you to stay with us for the next panel. Going on with our work, we're going to the second panel, and there's a topic, compliance on anti-corruption national law. As a mediator, we invite Medina Advogados, Masters of Sorbonne in the University of Sorbonne in Paris, and Ethics of Compliance in the University of Sergi-Pontoise in France, Dr. Pedro Henrique Leite. Welcome, and thank you for coming here. You're going to be our mediator. As a speaker, we invite the Director of Integrity of Compliance and Management of Risks from BNDES, former minister and the manager of CGU, and Finance, COAF, Dr. Luiz Augusto Fraga Navarro de Brito Filho.
Sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Com a palavra, o mediador, Dr. Pedro.
Welcome, everyone. With the floor, Mediator Pedro Henrique for conducting all the work. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank for the presentation. I would like to register more or less my satisfaction in the seminar with the reflection and the anti-corruption law, and next to so many wonderful professionals. I would like to greet and congratulate Your Excellency, President of OAB, Fred Monetti. Thank you for opening the door for the seminar. And especially, I would like to salute Dr. Fábio Medina Osório, President of the Minister, which I would like to say my sincere thanks for the invitation and the friendship and the valuable knowledge that you have been teaching together with the office Medina Osório and lawyers. It is my satisfaction to mediate and present Dr. Luiz Augusto Fragas Navarro de Filho, a lawyer with an amazing trajectory in the public administration, had the fundamental role in elaborating norms relating to anti-corruption law and contributed to the talk about this law and ministering courses and anti-corruption law all over Brazil. He's a specialist in the topic, technician of credibility. Dr. Navarro for sure will bring such an importance speech on compliance and the corruption line. Dr. Navarro, welcome. I'll give you the floor and have a wonderful speech, everyone. Good. Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. I'd like to thank especially Fábio Osório for the invitation. And for me, it's always a matter of, when we talk about anti-corruption law in the past, at the same time, to see how it has evolved along the time and what is its the challenges and perspectives maybe in the changes throughout time, and especially in relation to compliance. We have talked about the last few years several reflections on when it comes to its utility and also its dimension, and when we talk effectively about what we need to expect from compliance. When anti-corruption law was brought up, it was drawn. When this anti-corruption law was drawn, there were several proposals with a new law. We had a reason to elaborate this law, which was the question of obligation that Brazil had to assume to take over as with international organisms and international conventions in relation that which Brazil had to adhere to have an anti-corruption law that would punish the transnational bribe, in which sometimes we don't remember, but it was said, it was there on the law that before it was adopted. And so the international pressure for us to be in compliance in the convention in which we adhered are very strong to punish Brazilian companies that eventually that would bribe public agents abroad. But the internal point of view, this was a lot more organized. And there was a lot more mobilization, not just with the transnational bribe, but also in the national corruption, so to speak, which is evidently very understandable. But in relation to this internal corruption, there was always a debate that why are we going to need one more law, and that what is different in these new legislation in relation to what we have in the administrative sector and other legal provisions. In reality, I like to always remember we've lived in a time where I think Brazil recently, or maybe not so recently, were in a period that was extremely diverse, where you can go from one side, the pendulum went from one extreme to another, extreme impunity and extreme excessive punity. So maybe now we are now in a period of accommodation, a period that cannot mean accommodation, that inaction. So back then, I imagine so that back then there was no part of the legal entities that could effectively be, where it comes to irregularity, would be punished when it comes to that, or wrongful acts of bribing and public administration. So I believe that
with certain conviction that back then we wanted to have some sort of reparation for legal entity by applying a fine. Legal or fines in terms of money, they are established. They are established by the regulatory acts or agencies, but they are not necessarily paid. And what is different in the anti-corruption law that differentiates this to legal entities that usually question this application or this fining from these other instruments, this punishment instruments, is that what stands out, what is the difference, is in a way, in case the legal entity does not celebrate, does not make an agreement or a plea bargain agreement, and they decide to pay the fine, it will be considered not eligible to hire with the administration or to be part of the procurement processes of the administration. And the other sanction is for the companies to be included in the registry of companies that are non-eligible to work with the public administration. And the second one is after they are, and it would be sentenced publicly. So these three factors of being non-eligible to make agreements with the public or to sign a contract with the public administration, and to make public this punishment in terms of the sanction that was enacted, and also to be part of the punished companies, forces the companies to try and establish solutions. Because we know that the major reason for the stops big companies, and people have already asked me this, and I was also criticized to say that the anti-corruption law is against big companies and not for everyone. It's not applicable to everyone. The reason that motivates these companies is to overcome a reputation problem that is relevant, or to be defendant in a lawsuit that is based on the anti-corruption law, which is what happens all over the world, especially in the US, when the DOJ or the exchange commissions or the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, when they start filing a lawsuit against the companies, the damage to their reputation is really big, especially the valuation. It affects directly the valuation of the stock market, and that forces and that encourages the companies to start and to celebrate or to sign an agreement with these two agencies. Another factor that was always present, considering the establishing or passing a anti-corruption law, was the one to find an agreed solution between government and companies. I'm a bit weary of the government to stay away from companies, for the gap or for the chasm to grow ever more between the companies and the government. And this concern is not just an empirical one, but we distanced the private sector from the public sector. And we did that by saying or by doing the following. The civil servants and public officials, they are concerned about innovating, talking to the private companies, finding solutions that will actually please the public sector and the private sector. Finding solutions that were agreed, such as the plea bargain agreement, was always the goal. And that was the point when the law was passed. But it's not a perfect one. And that's so much so that the Office of the Controller's Office, the CGU, with this situation, the situation is not very well defined, in the sense that too much is asked by the company to sign a plea bargain agreement. And the third aspect of the law that we look, and that was finally one of the final goals of the law, was to foster the compliance or to foster a healthy environment for the public companies, for the private companies. And retrospectively, in the past 20 years, if we manage to achieve the three goals, or depending on the agreements that we're trying to achieve, which is the objectives of the law, I would say that in terms of enforcement beyond the federal government, we have a very moderate enforcement of the law, considering the state and the municipal governments as well. But if we consider the federal government, Brazil might be the country with the most enforcement, along with the United States of a law of this type. Considering the leniency agreements, with all of the ups and downs, we achieved some results. Of course, there is doubt considering the adjustments that have to be made and the leniency agreements. And it's evident that all of this was contaminated in one way or another by the car wash operation. It was not a mature law, so we had to lastly, and it's something what the Professor Osório said. And what is the compliance to avoid the new cases, the application of the law, that were enforcement of the law?
Programas de fachada. Esse é o nosso permanente desafio, que é evitar programas de fachada, mas, ao mesmo tempo,
which is to agree to bring the credibility in the terms of compliance,
como remédio quanto a eventuais sanções contra empresas. Então, me concentrando mais no que me...
And focusing on what is pertinent here, which is to talk about compliance.
E como disse, né, os objetivos da LAC deram certo, né? Conseguimos enforcement, acho que sim.
And the law enforcement, we managed to achieve the enforcement, and we also we exaggerated in a specific manner some fines that were and applied excessive fines that are not payable. Fines that will not let the companies to leave, or allow them to leave. Because we did a calculation of the fine, and when we're talking about us, I'm referring to myself, right? So we did a calculation or a math that in a specific way can be very punishing. And we are pulling together not only the fine that is provided for in the law, even though it is limited to the 3 times the amount of the damage, but we also added to the fine. We added to the reparation of the damage. The reparation of the damage has to do with, and it has to do with the involvement of other agencies that are not necessarily involved in the process, especially when we were with at the beginning of the anti-corruption law. It was a bit hard for And it was really a hellish situation, which was to live. They had to live with different situations in different institutions of the public authority applying the laws. So the companies had to deal with the Federal Prosecution Service, the State Prosecution Service, the Federal Prosecution Office, and the Office of the Controller General, and the Federal Court of Accounts. When the law only talks about the National Controller's Office, the Office of the Controller General, and it's not easy to sign a lenience agreement or to be serene in terms of the legal entity that in specific moment that they ran out of resources, and they take a long time. They know how hard it is for some companies, and I'm talking about him, not her. And because he was in the board of director of Petrobras, right after the horrible situation for the companies to survive when they are defendants in a lawsuit that is based on the anti-corruption law, whatever it is. And an issue that should not be done this way. And in the way that it establishes the competence and for the Office of the Controller General to decide on these cases. And the last issue, and it seems that it's a more open one, even though the other ones are not unimportant, and they might be the punish the companies is the compliance part. I'm wondering if we are moving forward or we are failing. As my personal perspective, I have a more optimistic view in life. And I always thought that it was better to have more compliance than to have no compliance at all. The fact is that this is still true today, but I believe that compliance found some difficult spots. They have to do with how far we can advance with compliance and how far Brazil has an ethical behavior in the organizations, and from the perspective, financial perspective of the companies, how worthy it is. Because when the law was approved, the writing of Article 7 was a very simple one. It was actually pretty limited. I remember that there was a worker that was writing and working in my legal advisory that wrote the draft of the 7th article of this law that showed that this extent of these procedures, the auditing, and the encouragement of complaints and irregularities, and the violations of the ethics code and the legal entity should be taken into consideration when enforcing the sanctions. And starting then, Dr. Fabio, we limited the reach of the compliance in terms of enforcement. And why did we do that? Because from the very beginning, why wasn't it possible to use compliance to be a reason not to punish the companies? In truth, that was very little acceptance in the media or in the society in order for us to say that a company that had an integrity or an ethics or compliance program would not be eligible for corruption acts. Back then, it would have been really hard for us to win this debate and to enable a provision in the law to achieve this specific goal. And that got even worse when the car wash operation, during this period of the car wash operation. When this happened in the car wash operation, it was very hard for certain, especially for the Federal Prosecution Service, to sort what the punishment was of the legal entity and the accountability of the natural persons. There was a decision, and of certain areas of the Federal Prosecution Service, in the sense that one thing should be connected to the other, to connect the sanction and the legal entity to the accountability of the person, and to connect the leniency agreement and or plea bargain agreement with the lenience agreement. They're completely different things, and they don't make any sense. It's the same thing to say that to the manager of the company in Portuguese. It's the same thing as saying to the leniency agreement, if you make a plea bargain agreement. So that is a complete connection, and considering the shareholders. So lets the companies go bankrupt while that stockholders don't make a plea bargain agreement. And there is a lot of literature considering that, and that ended the competitiveness of a lot of big companies, especially within the international market, because
the anti-corruption law is not about giving the responsibility to a natural person. Instead, it only talks about giving the responsibility to the legal entity. You cannot deal with one issue and link it to another. But I remember that several times I tried to add this logic and this interpretation without success. And sometimes with lots of critics to show that this companies should keep going independently of the responsibility of their shareholders. But the truth is, we failed. The truth is that I don't know yet if this confusion in the past is delayed, it's old-fashioned. I don't know if today there was a similar phenomenon such as Lava Jato, if we could separate that is the responsibility of the company to what is the responsibility of the people, the natural person or individual. And that was always a question that I have asked myself several times. In the end, what is the legacy of everything that happened? Do we have a legacy? So those questions that I asked earlier, the objectives, were they attained? And it's a legacy that's very hard to establish because in the end, we go back to where we were. In the end, we go back to a picture of impunity for the people that are responsible and low sanctions for the companies and corporations that are involved with corruption act. And then we started a regulation, and I'm not here to talk about all the predictions of the decree when it comes to anti-corruption law. I'm not here to say how the corporations should establish their programs of compliance. In the end, my questioning is we should do this. Should we give funds to the corporations and say, hey, this is how you should have a compliance. This is how you should work to have compliance. You should give the training, courses. They should follow at least 13 of what's in the decree 11,129. Because we shouldn't have to do that. Especially because when we do that, the motivation you give is the motivation that the corporation should adopt all the programs of their facade, the fake programs. It doesn't matter what kind of a front program. It doesn't matter if it's a pharmaceutical company. They will all have one kind of compliance program. But they will follow the same brochure, even including the public sector. In the public sector, we're following the same directives of the private sector. And then we evidently, in the public sector, we are in a relation that's a lot different from the private sector. And because I myself in the BNDES or Mario Vinicius in the Petrobras, we need to protect BNDES and Petrobras so that none of the people from the organization receive bribery. And those who are the private sector need to protect his or her company so that none of his agents will bribe a public agent. But we adopted the same program, the same compliance program. And I keep saying, I've been saying this for years. And in the end, I see that I'm doing bringing a criticism to myself, because I haven't still found a way to do differently. But certainly, there are things that should be different, are things that should be improved. I will not extend myself a lot further, but it's what I'm saying. In the end, what we mold, we're talking about compliance, when it comes to compliance, was a menu to be served ready. See, Professor Fabio was saying recently about proethics. I believe that I wanted to give a lot of compliments to proethics. Proethics is one of the best evaluation of compliance program that I know. But there is no answer that we can absorb that a company that goes through Proética is a company that is integral. Because the integrity of a company goes beyond the checklist that you can do on the compliance. When it comes to compliance, the integrity of a company or a corporation goes way beyond the guidelines. And whether the guidelines can expand and counsel the companies to do. Evaluation is still something that's extremely difficult. And another matter that really comes, that opened my eyes is that we should give the adequate benefits so that the company can invest in compliance programs. I remember recently in CGU, people were celebrating because they had modified the decree and changed the highest grade for taking away the fine for effective compliance from 4% from 5%. Who from that is anyone going to do anything? Is going to change anything because of this small change? No one receives 5%. No one ever received even 4%. So the idea of who has compliance in reality to look for 4 or 5% off, the regulators cannot be eluded that the companies are moving towards compliance because of 4 or 5% off on some eventual fine in case it happens on a case of corruption. In reality, the companies are moving towards compliance, and that comes the optimistic part of my speech. They're moving towards compliance because it's what the market has been requiring. They are moving towards compliance like we're moving towards ecological transition, green economy. They're moving towards compliance because you can't keep living without compliance. It's not good for business. I remember that always the president of Siemens had huge problems when it comes to transactional corruption for many, many years. It was the largest fine that was written by DOG and SEC, but then later there were billions of dollars or euros, they invested billions of dollars in euros compliance. And this vice president of Siemens was always saying, and this was repeated in all the seminars, that compliance is expensive, but try not having compliance. So this was very used in the past. I think now this is the following. We do have compliance. Whoever wants to grow, or whoever wants to grow, who doesn't want to grow will not have compliance. We recently in BNDES, we signed an agreement with CGU in order so that all the companies of a large size that have operation with BNDES have necessarily must obligatory have compliance. It's not a matter of just looking to the fact that the problem, the harm of not having compliance is larger than not having is larger than having. So how do you want to present yourself to the market? How do you want to present yourself to the market, with compliance or without compliance? I probably went over my time already. Some of them, I want to talk about a few more things. One of them I have already spoken about, the fact that compliance can be expensive, bureaucratic, and in the end, everybody say that, well, compliance needs to change. We just need to change the culture, as if it was easy to just change the culture. We change the culture with rules, enforcing rules. Compliances are rules. Compliances have nothing to do with seducing people for the ethics. It has nothing to do with that. I always talk about Vinicius because we're good friends. It's like holding the rail on Petrobras. People hold it because they learn how to hold it. Because that's a company where, unfortunately, every now and again, a very serious matter of security, not just in Petrobras, but in companies, have this issue, and Petrobras is one of them. But some rules need to be completely absorbed. These are rules, they're not ethical behaviors. Ethical behaviors are much more difficult and don't have necessarily have to be followed when it comes to compliance. As hard as it is to say this. And there are several dangers when that goes around compliance, and the largest one of them is maybe the over compliance and extra compliance, the compliance, the overload of compliance, excessively bureaucratic. Because in the end, at the end of the line, if you are in a management sector, if you're a compliance officer, for instance, someone can say, why am I doing this? Why is this so much work? Why do I have to have so much work for this? How much is this going to cost to the company? And it's not just for this side that's merely economical and excess of bureaucracy that the compliance comes in. It's also in another area of a determined unfairness when it comes to the company and people. When it comes to people. So sometimes you come and you see people that they practically cannot open an account at a bank because at some point they were under some kind of investigation, object of investigation, even if they were never named in that investigation. Or you have companies that cannot do business because at the same time they were accused by the press, that they were involved in the corruption action. So in this sense, that I say that the overcompliance is a challenge, and it's a problem, it's a harm for compliance, ends up being harm, because every time we work on excess and we practice excess restriction against individuals or legal entity, we certainly are not
atingindo o objetivo.
attaining the objective of compliance. And so to wrap up,
Deveríamos aumentar os benefícios?
we should increase the benefits. Yes, we should increase the benefits. If there's compliance in terms of the law,
4, 5,
we could not just be on the 4 or 5%.
seria
It's not enough.
servir de
We should, in my opinion,
contra a acusação de perigo.
use it as a medication against
Já que não estamos
the legal entity. Since we're having front programs, can we improve the inspection? No, we can't.
pergunta, a resposta
Its answer is simple.
podemos apostar na autorregulação?
Can we try auto-regulation?
Podemos apostar na
I think so. We could try to bet on auto-regulation.
o compliance.
Should we make compliance mandatory?
Olha, eu já tive diversas
I have already had several opinions, and I even wrote yes at once, but I question it. But I think that we could go on, move towards a solution that at least the big companies should be mandatory to have compliance. So I want to apologize for going over my time, and I thank very much for the invitation, for being here present, and to say that even though my septic tone, I'm very happy with compliance. I agree with compliance. We should deal in a better overview of everything. It's more just, more fair in the competitiveness of the companies in the ethic moment. Thank you very much.
Para a entrega do certificado de participação,
To give the award for participation of the speaker, Dr. Luiz Augusto Navarro Barra Filho, we invite the mediator, Ferreira Leite.
da mesma forma, convidamos o
In the
palestrante
same way, we ask the speaker, Dr. Luiz Fraga Navarro, to receive the participation or attendance certification in the seminar.
Agradecemos a presença dos ilustres
So we
participantes
thank
do
the
painel
presence
e
of the speakers in the panel, and we ask for a round of applause.
Passamos neste momento para o terceiro painel com o tema
Now we
individual.
start the third panel with the topic individualization of the punishment in the corporate anti-corruption law. As the mediator, we ask the legal advisor of the National Bank of Economic Development and Social Development, prosecutor, federal prosecutor, and former advisor secretary of the Ministry of Planning and Management, and a doctorate student by the University of Coimbra, Dr. Valdo Baire Filho. A round of applause to him, our mediator. And as a speaker, we ask the Executive Director of Governance and Compliance of Petrobras, Doctor in Public Administration and Government by the FGV Foundation of São Paulo, and the Master of Public Administration by the João Pinheiro Foundation in Minas Gerais, Dr. Mário Vinícius Glausen Spinel.
Sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Com a palavra o mediador, Dr. Walter.
You're welcome. With the floor, Dr. Valdo Baire Filho to conduct the work.
Muito bom dia.
Good morning.
Agradecer o gentil convite.
First, I'd like to thank the invitation of my dear friend, Professor Fábio Dino Osório, who is a specialist in
10 anos.
this matter. In the 10th anniversary
É importante a gente
of the
refletir
anti-corruption law, it is important to reflect on that we have to advance,
e para isso
And we have to think of the legacy. And with that, we count on the presence of the specialist of the matter, that is an authority that is ahead, and one that might have had one of the most traumatic experiences in enriching regarding his own compliance. So without any further ado, I pass the floor to Dr. Mário Spinelli to start his presentation. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you. It's a pleasure to share his space with us, and thank Dr. Fábio Rosario for this invitation. The idea is to have a quick reflection on the 10th anniversary of the law 10,846, and especially its enforcement by Petrobras. So I think it's an important thing to do this reflection and remembering that on November 26 of 2013, I published an article which is the private sector and victim or the perpetrator. Okay, so it's something that and looking at this 10 past years, I wonder if the companies are actually interested in adopting the compliance measurements. And because especially the period before the car wash operation, and considering an investigation of the INSS and especially the 400 companies in the civil construction. And I wonder if those companies were actually interested in adopting compliance measurements. And compliance already existed in Brazil, but it was constricted to transnational companies, well-regulated companies, to big companies, and the corruption law had been already approved. It was in effect in January 2014, and after that it was regulated even before the federal government. And considering what happened back then, since then, what's changed? What happened after that? I wanted to know whether was there a real interest by the private sector in following compliance? I believe that the main merit it was to bring the law into the light, and it was highlighted here very clearly by the minister of CGU, contrary to what happened with the legislation of CADE, in which the model was tested. The car wash operation started right away, and in practice was an enforcement of the most relevant aspects of the law. I believe the main aspect of the law is to bring the law into the limelight, and a lot happened. In São Paulo, there was compliance events. There were compliance events every week. What compliance was like, and so it did shake the market. And as a cascade effect or a chain reaction effect, the less engaged companies started engaging more because the competition was investing in it. But I believe the main change was a change that didn't happen only in Brazil. It was a change that happened all over the world, which was in this hyper-connected world. The perception that of the image that was encouraged in the investment in the small and medium-sized companies, and we're a more attentive world, paying to the ethical aspects. There is a generation that is more connected to it, and that's why compliance goes towards human rights issues, a more attentive outlook in terms of prevention of harassment, So we see how that costs money and reputation as well. Sometimes one single case compromises the effort of years in terms of compliance. So a lot has changed. But the main challenge in all of the analyses that are made is for us to have the capacity to see and to look at compliance of what it actually works. So Petrobras is working, conducting the administrative procedures of accountability. So today, the figures that we have after 10 years of approving the law is Petrobras has a fundamental role. 18% of the sanctions that are applied, and it's the entity that it's more that the one that most applies these laws against this. We've applied or reinforced over 200 million reais in fines to create an area that will deal specifically with disciplinary measures of accountabilities in the workers from Petrobras, but also companies. It's the first time that Petrobras has an ombudsman, an area that is dedicated to working in this area. And talking about the numbers here. So Petrobras shows recently, as the Office of the Controller General says, we are responsible for like 18%, but basically 1 in every 5 sanctions that are applied by Petrobras, which is a very relevant number. And it grew a lot, especially in the past 2-3 years. We've been broadening our action in the anti-corruption law scope. But it's important to know that our action goes beyond the accountability process. We have a process that is very robust in the due diligence of integrity. There's this assessment that we do in Petrobras, and there is a major supply chain of, we have over 200,000 suppliers, and these providers or the suppliers, they have a risk assessment analysis, and if they're classified in high risk, they are prevented from hiring with the company. So there is a technical assessment that is made in 3 stages, and we try to extend this demand of integrity. And Petrobras has a very robust process, and we try to extend this to our suppliers as well. And after, in October 1st, we asked from the suppliers the human rights issues also. So if the supplier wants to continue being part of the tender process by Petrobras, they need to implement a policy of harassment prevention, slave-like labor relations, preventions, actions in terms of data protection, which is a fundamental right that was inserted into the federal constitution. So we extend the level of demands that we make to our suppliers. Recently, when we started demanding this, someone that was interested in the topic sent me a message. Are you going to pay more? They asked me. Because companies are going to invest more in compliance. So are you going to pay more? So that is going to increase the cost. Yes, but we want to have an integral relationship with everyone that relates to us. So there is no use in having a prevention system of harassment in Petrobras if the supplier companies don't have this system. So we have over 40,000 workers in Petrobras directly, but our supply chain has more than 140,000 workers, and they're working in the facilities of Petrobras. So there is no use if I have a policy of harassment prevention if the other person is not doesn't have the right benefit to this right. Okay, so that is a demand that extends to the network. And in our system, in application of the 12,846 law, one of the assessments that we did in the 10th anniversary of the law. So why are companies being punished? Who detects that? Is it in the auditing phase, our control, internal controls? Is it our hotline? And the most relevant thing that I consider is that 75% of the cases in starting this process, the initiative was from the manager himself. And that was the person that detected and says, here we have an accountability process of the company. And why is that relevant? Because it shows the dissemination of the compliance culture. It's the manager that is paying attention to that, and that represents more than our complaint hotline, which is really important, but just 12% and they are born, they are created in this hotline, and more than in our internal procedures that are according to 13%. So 3 out of 4 procedures are started by the managers themselves. The manager that is on the platform, the oil rig, and he's the one that action starts the action. And we have 216 procedures that were started, so 179 in Petrobras and the rest in Vispetro. In the whole Petrobras system, we have a lot of them, and we had over 213 million fines that were sanctioned, over 100 companies that were sanctioned, 74 procedures that are ongoing, and the punishments that were applied. 94 could not hire with the company anymore, and the other ones that are being punished and are made public in the violation that was perpetrated against the Petrobras system. So that is a framework, or is an overview of the enforcement of the law by Petrobras. It's a very robust procedure with an expert team, and evermore we're considering this procedure inspired on the model of the Office of the Controller General, and due to a very robust procedure in the legal sphere, and we don't want it to be annulled, right? So fortunately, the legal decisions have been confirming our administrative decisions. And it's natural that our intention is not to punish a company. We want to enforce the law, but when necessary, we are achieving this result. The main infractions on these violations, we're talking about procurement process frauds. 23% of the companies that were sanctioned were to do with a fraud in the performing contract, 77% in the people, and also in conceding and granting advantages. This is a situation that shows, and especially considering this here, he asked me to talk about the Petrobras model. And as I said before, one of the problems that we've had with our suppliers is that these cases are necessary. They feed back into our compliance system. So one thing that we realize is that some companies that are service providers that are going to compete in a very technical procurement service, such as providing an oil rig to provide a service, and the level of demand is very high in terms of certifications for work conditions and technical certifications, and the companies provide fraudulent certifications. So now we are preventing with the preventing this with the suppliers. We tell them we are punishing people who are doing this. So it's feedbacking into our system so that the system can help preventing these actions so that they don't happen again. It's a preventive work, and that's the goal. And punishment should be a last resort, which should not be the first step. So punishment has an educational aspect to it. And the procedure is conducted by our government of compliance, and the decision is made by a independent committee that is formed by 3 people. One is a worker from Petrobras that has worked for this committee. They're selected, and 2 external members that are hired by the Petrobras, and it's this council or this group committee that applies the punishment. And after that, the resources or the appeals considering this decision within the company. So this model is a model that tries to promote fairness, and it has been achieving the results that I have shown here. So that is the point. I talked about the feedbacking into the system here. The goal is to show how the system works in Petrobras and the relevant aspects that, and also we have here the other situation that were made by the private sector, and it shows how the system has been working effectively to disseminate this culture of integrity and also to contribute so that this relationship between the private sector and how this relationship can be a healthier one with the public sector. And the next step is to establish our strategic plan in 2024-2025, and one of our goals is to extend the due diligence to 100% of the most critical suppliers, which are and also to tag this and all the auditing of compliance in the big companies, right, that relate to us. That was what I wanted to show you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to compliment to great value, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning with you. First, I'd like to thank you for this presentation. It's a very good example of Petrobras, and the numbers are amazing, right? In terms of the effectiveness and the enforcement of the program. So that was our general comment, and I finalize here the panel. Is there any time for questions and answers? Or for a dialogue, but I just wanted to thank you for the presentation. And to deliver the certificate of attendance to Dr. Spinelli, we ask the mediator Walter Paredes Filho to hand him the certificate. And in the same way, we ask the speaker, Dr. Mário Vinícius, for receiving the certificate of participation of mediator. We thank you for the participation of these participants of this panel, and we ask for a round of applause. Now we go to the fourth panel with the topic Leniency Agreements. As the speaker, we ask the Secretary of Private Property and Private Integrity and the Auditor of the Office of the Controller General and the Secretary of Private Integrity, Specialist in National Economy by the George Washington University, and the Public Law by also doctorate by Plano CUB and master with with Notre Dame, Master of Law by the University of Notre Dame in the U.S. Marcelo Pontes Viana, a round of applause, please. With the floor, mediator Dr. Fábio for leading the works. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Marcelo Pontes Viana, Secretary of Private Integrity from the Office of the Controller General, Federal Auditor of the Federal Court of Accounts. His CV was read by the Master of Ceremonies. For the last panel, it's an honor. Let's hear him. He is a legal expert. In reality, we just have to. He has a law background and a cross-cutting education. Therefore, a differentiated point of view on the leniency agreements. And with the floor, Dr. Marcelo. Good morning, everyone. Initially, I'd like to thank Dr. Fábio for this invitation. When I started working at the Office of the Controller General, that was one of the most interesting books that I had to read, is the book by Dr. Fábio Dinosaurio, and ever since you have always been a reference for me and for receiving this invitation and to share my knowledge here in the OAB and my experience on the Federal Controller's Office. And the topic proposed here has to do with a leniency agreement, which was the way for us to start working with the anti-corruption law. Unintentionally, the anti-corruption law innovated into the CGU, and we created the work area that we haven't experienced so far, which is the accountability of legal entities. And here what we said, the major challenge that we had at the very beginning, implemented the anti-corruption law, had to do with the different requests of leniency agreement that we had during the car wash operations that were very interesting ones.
We had lots of fun at that time, not to say it was very turbulent, but it was lots of learning and construction. I would like to comment today is a lot more than just look back, but I want to talk about some marks that are very important in the construction, but I also wanted to talk about challenge that we're facing when it comes to this topic. Many times we focus what was wrong, the problems, but it's also important to look at what worked. So some numbers that are not known, it's important to look at because they're very significant and they symbolize how much this topic has grown when it comes to CGU. We have 25 agreements that were celebrated. It's a very large number. 18 billion, in fact, that were paid by the collaborating corporation when it comes to fee and also refund. Also, 8.78 billion was already paid, almost 9 billion. It's also a very expensive number, and for recuperation and recovering all the harm that had happened. We have 25 agreements that were celebrated throughout this 10 years with 88 request of leniency agreement. This 88, we had 38 that didn't have an agreement, come to an agreement, which shows that also maturity from our part, that the legal people understand that this is not how you propose an agreement that you can have successful You also see that there are risks that can be filled up. You have a need to let things mature. I'm going to talk about that as well. And I think it's very relevant to talk about when we're going to think about the history of the leniency agreement and the rest. We have 21 proposals that are negotiation are happening right now, and we hope to end this year with 2 agreements that are going to be celebrated by CGU, and it's going to be very advanced. And we have others are still going over, they're still going through process and have been perfection. And the company asked for an agreement in this negotiation. In many of these cases that were not celebrated, we realized that is because the company was not available or maybe couldn't even fill the prerequisites to celebrate a leniency agreement. And when I said that there's a significant number of agreements that were not come to fruition, a lot of them were because there was a perception from us that this agreement, leniency agreement, is thing that the agreement that the company agreed that they had to pay fine and they had to improve their compliance. They also had to help the state in giving and celebrating the agreement in a certain way, that they also had to bring evidence and help the public administration have better comprehension of the case. And what happened with it as the time went by and advancing this processes and responsibilization, we faced cases that the illicit the fraud that was committed by the company sometimes were through bribery here or benefits that are utilized wrongfully for fiscal matters. Situation that the company couldn't know more than what we knew. We had no more space to leverage another company. In the different models that we see in the punishment, there was no kind of, we didn't have this kind of transaction from the company. You had to trust the facts. You had in one extreme a company that would accept what's illicit, bring new information, and the other extreme, the company was defending herself. Do not want to cooperate and change their behavior. And between these 2 extremes, we ended up, what happened was many companies sat with us and said, look, I have nothing to defend myself. I admit, I think I was wrong and I want to turn the page. So how can I behave from now on? I want to litigate, but I don't fill up the prerequisites for this agreement. So now we call anticipated trial, where the company brings extra information and she wants to show that she's coming to conformity. She wants to prove that she's, and then turn the page on the mistake that she made. This anticipated trial, it's a model of negotiation. It's lots of success, more than 60 requests since August of last year. That's when it started until today. We have more than 30 anticipated trial and looking for recourse. But more than that, we need to have a manifest from the company that say, look, I want to continue this route, and naturally incentive structure, we will compensate this kind of behavior with less strong sanctions. And looking more objectively, we recognize that even though we had expressive success, we also recognize that she does not transmit through the numbers what was required, which is a term of agreement. She will come out with a trial that's a little not as harsh as it could in the past with this resolution. So we made a consultation in August, a normative proposal that will substitute the anticipated trial. We received many ideas from the specialized public on the matter, and we waited until February, March, and we should have a new norm that's going to complete this whole structure of resolution that we have. But in spite this number are so expressive, we recognize that there's still a lot to go in order to build a better system for leniency in general. I would say that the biggest challenge so for us to have a very well structured leniency agreement is a challenge that even the sanctioning administrative power has. It's an administrative right that we have a series of norms and legislation, and consequently public organs that have these competence, and sometimes they will overlap. And sometimes we have a conduct that will have legislature to be followed, or sometimes more. And what, for instance, I want to give an example is a public tender cartel. It's in the anti-corruption law, but also in the TCU. If you have a participation of public agent, it will be there. So we have a multidisciplinarity of public agents that can be recommended by the same conduct. And this has some positive sides. And the whole doctrine that specializes in the corruption area, you think that the most important benefit of this is that these agencies have the power to complement each other. Many times the public organ cannot detect that type of illicit action, but another one is able to complement and have a much more effective result. It will begin to be a problem when they dispute the same space, and we can see a lot of this when it came to the car wash incident. And another organ that would not detect the conduct, another organ will come in and try to infer in the same situation. But then we end up having now issues, and now we have a new, more classic doctrine, and realize it's possible to have this model. It's different legislations, like before it wasn't. We couldn't accept the same company be punished in CAD and then CGU and then suffer in different places, and also in TCU, for instance. I look at this now with a lot more optimism. This advancement on the debate, they have to be stronger. You can't just leave it, the sanctioning happening in multiple places, because also for the juristic, for the legal matter, it could be a fault from the state to allow this to happen. It's not something that shows being very effective in practice. You need to, however, yes, be proactive in the situation, but make it proportional and fair. It provokes exactly what you want from the sanction, which is a change in behavior. I think the most important challenge that we have here face, and one of the premises that mentioned when he invited me for this post, is to improve this cooperation between the states. And so the situation that we are facing, and you have overlapping competences, how can we make a more coherent state? And that's especially important when we talk about negotiable resolutions, when it comes to a leniency agreement. The basis is not only the administration interest, but also the infractor, the collaborator. It will only make sense if both parties win. It's a win-win situation in this exchange for more reduced sanctions for the collaborating parts. On the point of view for the collaborating corporation, it is only important for her to collaborate if she can predict and anticipate that by helping, she will come out better off than litigation. So it's better to have an agreement than not to have an agreement. So each state also agrees to have an agreement and use this jurisdiction state to build this safety and security. In multi-agencies, this coordination is very important to bring safety. You cannot celebrate an agreement with a company or a corporation with the state and tomorrow having to go to trial from TCU or CAG. She cannot celebrate an agreement with CAG and then having to answer from the other CGU, for instance. So we need to bring more predictability when this kind of a situation. When I'm doing here a mea culpa, the state wants to win what is expressed in this legislation, to consolidate doctrine, but also look to advance in these topics, and that this is the best way. And throughout this year, we've done several important marks in this line. We celebrated recently an agreement, a technical agreement with CAD, who has the objective of not just exchanging experiences, but also what to do in these cases. And the case when it's investigated by distinct organs and the logic, and also the celebration, also for the celebration of the agreement. Another advancement that I have seen is a better alignment in the cooperation between CGU and the Controller's Office of the Union. And you have inside them attributions, working together with CGU, with leniency agreement, and we're able to advance a lot when it comes to dialogues. They signed a cooperation agreement, a technical one in 2020 between the Ministry Office and CGU that has already, and then CGU has already traced some matters. Throughout this year, we implemented a lot of these technical agreements. CGU now is regulating internally this process like a right in the light of the cooperation, and we hope that this will keep going for so much that we have advanced this year. And we have a very nice dialogue in the public and federal ministry and work together with us in the leniency agreement. I think that is one of the biggest will of the collaborating companies and entities are to, when you close a controller's office, and then be aligned with CGU. I think that now that we're soon going to have a new public controllers of the Republic, there should be a legal jurisdiction in the judiciary and then with CGU. Well, aside from safety and legal, we shouldn't keep thinking the whole time how we can those incentives that we give to the companies in the following line. What's predicted in the anti-corruption law, they say that the company that proposed the leniency agreement, and what she'll have is a reduction in the fine of 2/3. She will be exempt from the sanctions and the public power. The fact that one company proposed an agreement admitting being illicit and giving back what was taken and accepting this responsibility, many times this company, when they see that's going to have a fine, financial fine, it's not an incentive that they expect, especially on the ordinary cases and the companies. And she said that she's capable of detecting even what happened to her. She has to accept that there's something wrong in her company, corporation. Before she identified, she remediated the problem. What do we expect from this company? That she comes from the state and she helps us. Today, this corporation that goes on this path, she still is going to have to pay a fine and reduce that's equivalent to 1/3 of the legislation. On the opposite of what we previewed, CAG is the total exemption and immunity. Here we don't have this immunity and administrative immunity complete. We receive lots of feedback from companies that say it's very hard for a company to bring, because it's she won't be motivated to have to pay the fine anyway. The legislation has not predicted this model, but we also began thinking if it's possible to give an exception for the law, that in these cases that the company has done everything that was expected of her. We start from the very simple premises. The companies are very complex entities, and no matter what, the illicit can still happen. That's a basic premise for us. If we admit that these programs, even though you could preview, predict, and remediate it, and still took to a place that is it fair that this company still get reprimanded?
Estamos com a promessa aí
We
de
developed a work with the FGV Foundation that is very interesting. In January, there will be a report of this working group that is going to talk about this, whether the Brazilian legislation would enable a leniency agreement if these requirements were fulfilled and the company would not pay the fine. Let's see if that is possible. We just have to consider it, which is a topic that is very important. And finalizing, that is also a challenge that is specific to any sanctioning administrative law, especially when we're talking about legal entity. How do we balance between sanctions that are going to be dissuasive, that are strong enough to avoid those conducts that are violation that will happen again, but are not debilitating, that will stop the company from working with the activity that they have. How can we find this optimum balance? And when we talk about sanctions for a natural person, it's easy. Of course, you can have a capital penalty or punishment, but in terms of legal entity, this debate also advanced a lot. When we look at the North American model, it's very common for the decisions of the DOJ to take into account the payment capacity or ability to pay. The DOJ is very pragmatic, and there is the calculation of the sanction. And in the decision, we see the health or the corporate health, and we see how much you can the sanction can be reduced, and it might be reduced drastically considering the ability to pay. And we have advanced a lot in the ability to pay question, but not to reduce the fine, but to make it installments or make a payment plan. And it would make sense to consider whether we would discuss a situation in which the state would have an upfront payment that is a reduction of the fine, or to submit the company for them to pay. And there is a debate, there is a lot of regulation to consider this, but there is also something that I usually do. So when we look at the trajectory of companies, there are many situations that will impact the life of a company to see if the company will be able to pay in 20 years, for example. That is not predictable, but on the other hand, but the company has to pay for what they did. So on the other side, we have to consider this as well. So these are the remarks that I wanted to make, that we have been thinking a lot within CGU, or they are self-reflections. I usually, when in the terms of the accountability process and the liability process, it counted with the social organizations and civil society, then expert lawyers in this topic. So it is a good thing that every topic that we advanced in the CGU will have this contribution. And one of the major problems that is to have a regulation that will not be fulfilled because it didn't take into account the people who were involved in this process. Everything we've been doing in CGU, we have had a lot of transparency, but also enabling the participation. So this year we did a public consultation. We're going to do this in every regulation that we issue, but besides this, we're always open to suggestions and to improve the models. That was it, and thank you very much for the invitation. 1/3 of the fine on what value? It's the gross revenue of the company. And especially depending on the percentage, a lot of factors that involve this, but the gross factor is the one that determines it. I'd like to congratulate Marcelo Ponce Viana, the Secretary of Private Integrity of CGU, or the Office of the Controller General, for this brilliant conference in this final panel of our seminar that approached topics that were considered strategic due to this the end of this seminar, and truly okay, good. So, the leniency agreement, which was the initiative of CGU, it is an exclusive initiative of the executive branch, and it's under discussion in the Supreme Federal Court. This active legitimacy of the Federal Prosecution Service that might have as a consequence the annulment of all the leniency agreements that were made by the Federal Prosecution Service. And we have to take into account, and I had the opportunity to assess many leniency agreements, and some of the agreements that were made by the Federal Prosecution Service. And it's not possible to compare the quality of these agreements in terms of individualization for the measures that were applied. So in many agreements with companies, the Federal Prosecution Service, at least some of that I examined, there was no individualizations, and in the case of the misconduct, and with absurdly high values. And that happened with parameters that were calculated within the CGU. CGU nowadays has a perspective of rethinking and value and amounts that were applicable within the sanctioning administrative law, which is possible within a legal situation
Viana falou, que é
that within the Marcelo Viana, which is the principle of non-repetition. And that's something that happened a lot within the sanctioning administrative sector law, using the legal precedents of the Federal Supreme Court. This perspective as well, that CGU pointed out in the studies of the FGV, are also interesting due to what I talked about my presentation, which is the compliance criteria effective, that the effective compliance as a parameter of the causal link to apply this. And for leniency agreements, to generate a total exclusion of the fine, and since this agreement generated an effective result in the collaborations with corroboration elements for sentencing results, it seems also a line we cannot, it's an interesting part. We cannot forget in Brazil that there was an industry of plea bargain agreements. There was a manufactured situation, especially with the car wash operation. There was a plea bargain agreement excessive. And both many of the members of the government and the academic experts as well, with the amount of agreements that were made without elements of evidentiary elements. There was a collaboration that the Federal Prosecution Service did, and they understood that the elements, the evidence that were brought by the person trying to plead were such as emails and bank balances and bank statements. And very often, the Federal Prosecution Service, they mixed these elements that were brought by the person, helping as evidence. And it's not like this, because the Supreme Federal Court made it clear that each one of those elements are not corroborating elements. What should be done here? It's an internal document. So there should be wiretapping, and also they should have access to the email. They should perform a search and warrant arrest search and warrant document. So to effectively, what has to be seen is the effective result of the agreement, the leniency agreements, and the effective results of the plea bargain agreement. But with this, I here finalize the seminar, and helping and thanking the legal advisor of the Bank of Brazil that is here present, Dr. Lucinea. I thank once again the president of the OAB, the Federal Brazilian Bar Association of Lawyers, and Betsy Monetti, and the opening that was made by the Minister Marcos de Carvalho from the Office of the Controller General. I also thank in the last panel, the Marcelo Pontes Viana, and I also thank everyone, all of the speakers that came here to help us with the seminar, that were effectively with us. Luiz Augusto Fraga Navarro de Brito Filho, Mário Spinelli, Pedro Henrique Ferreira Leite, Walter Baeri Filho, all of the speakers and everyone who was here with us that helped us and attended, that it only helps us. We'd like to thank you for the help that you provided to the Special Committee of Sanctioning Administrative Law and the International Study of the rights of the state. And with these final words, I declare finalized the seminar. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We invite Dr. Fabio Medino for the delivery of the attendance certification to Dr. Marcelo Pontes Viana.
Muito bem, senhoras e senhores, está encerrado
Well,
então o nosso
So, ladies and gentlemen, our meeting is finalized, and we wish you all a very good afternoon.
Obrigado pelo convite. Eu te agradeço mais. É maravilhoso.